This is Keith Ward with Visual Studio Magazine, and I'm here with James Conard, who was our keynote speaker at day 2 of our VS Live conference. James is with Microsoft. James, tell us what you do at Microsoft.
Cool. So Keith, I lead the technical evangelism team for Windows Azure at Microsoft. And so what that involves, technical evangelism is kind of one of those strange roles, not quite development, it's not sales, but it's one of those roles that's critically important at Microsoft, and something you've seen from across the industry, a lot of other people embrace. What we do is essentially we go to a lot of conferences like VS Live, to our build conferences and other events, and we talk with developers, helping them really understand how to use Windows Azure services. It goes well beyond just conferences though, so a lot of the things that you see coming from Microsoft to assist developers in building applications, in my case for Windows Azure, like tutorials and the samples and training kits, are resources we go put out into the community. Completely as open source, completely free, just to enable developers to more readily get access to Microsoft platform technologies.
And of course, that was the keynote you gave this morning, was on Windows Azure and everything related to it. So when you talk to these developers, what do you tell them? Talk to me like I'm a typical developer in a shop. Why should I be interested in Windows Azure?
Cool, great question. So at the highest level, you can think of Windows Azure as Microsoft's platform for cloud computing. And so every one of these developers around here is building an app. Whether that be a web-based application, whether it's a complex multi-tier application where they've separated out some of their caching logic and their business logic and their integration systems, whether that maybe even be a mobile application these days. How many people are walking around with multiple devices that are connected in some way to some back end to store data or drive notifications? And so there's just a huge number of scenarios where you are going to, as a developer over the next few years, want to take advantage of the cloud. And those are just a few that I've touched on. And so as a developer who's building with Visual Studio, what you're going to see is just that integrated support for taking advantage of Windows Azure services. Just the ability to just right click and say publish straight to Azure. The ability to pull up Server Explorer and manage and access your Azure services. And so as this evolution to the cloud occurs, across everywhere from corporate and enterprise environments to our kind of the traditional software partners, even mobile application developers. As that transition occurs, if you're a Visual Studio developer, there's no better place to start on the cloud than Windows Azure.
But one of the challenges I'm sure that you face is developers telling you, look, I don't want my database in the cloud. I want it on premises. I don't know about the security issues surrounding the cloud right now. There's a lot sort of unknowns, at least in their minds. How do you get over, particularly the security question, their data sitting, in the cloud on someone else's server?
Yep, there's a lot of considerations that come up, right? Security, and you can take that one actually from few different forms, right? Just, how are we authenticating and authorizing access to that data? What happens within the data center since that's actually under somebody's control? What are the regulatory requirements for my application, right? And there's a vast majority of the cases where people are going to be able to go and run and store and manage their data in the cloud. You already see that today with data that's one of the most valuable assets customers have, which is their customer data. Look how many CRM-based systems today are based in a cloud-based solution. But we have to recognize that there are some situations, some solutions where the data or the application itself needs a degree of isolation and control, or maybe the cloud isn't quite the right fit. And so what we do with Windows Azure is that there's several different models that we enable for you to integrate assets of Azure with applications. So if you want to get into this more hybrid mode where maybe perhaps your data is still in your on-premises environment, still within the data center where you have physical access to that data, but you've been able to go move the compute resources. So those resources where you need the more flexibility, you need the ability to go scale, maybe even deploy across multiple locations around the world. That's where you go move those types of services out into the cloud with Windows Azure and connect back into your on-premises environment for your data. And so there's a wide variety of different hybrid scenarios that we see customers doing today as well.
Okay. Now, Azure, of course, is one option among many. Obviously there's Amazon, there's Google, there's VMware, there's Oracle. Everyone seems to have a cloud solution. Why should they consider Windows as a top choice over the competition?
Yep. So, in fact, a lot of those providers that you mentioned actually provide Windows support as well, right? And so, really, I think the question is, why should we think about Windows Azure for running our .NET Visual Studio-based solutions, primarily for a lot of the developers here, relative to some of the other cloud-based providers? There's a lot of key things, and so on this journey as we move towards the cloud, one of the key things I touched on earlier is if you are a .NET Visual Studio developer, there's going to be no better place to go take advantage of that tool set and those resources than with the cloud that's developed and managed by the same company that builds everything from the operating system to the framework stack and the tools, and so everything in between. And so what Microsoft's going to be able to do is provide that complete application stack end to end, including the data centers that you rely on for all kinds of other services today, like Windows Update as an example. Right. So that same underlying infrastructure powering those applications that you create. So that's one of the key reasons.
Sure. Yeah. A lot of developers, as you know, everything is moving toward mobile, and you discussed that in your keynote. For those developers who are working on iOS, they're working on Android, they're working on Windows 8. What is the Azure story for them? Can they work just as easily if you're working on a non-Microsoft product as you can with these other mobile platforms?
Yep. So believe it or not, you actually can. So it's kind of surprising where Microsoft has come from, but in the last year just alone, we've introduced a new service called Mobile Services. And with this new service, what you can actually do is just turn on an endpoint, an API that you can go code against as a developer, and code against that from any language framework you want. In fact, what we've done is we've exposed out SDKs for all of those client platforms you mentioned. So there's an SDK for Windows Store, for Windows Phone, but also for iOS, for Android, and for just building cross-platform web experiences with HTML and JavaScript. And so SDKs allow you to go consume those service endpoints that are exposed from mobile services, and you do that from any platform.
All right, so thanks for joining us today, James. It was a pleasure to talk to you about Windows Azure.
Thanks a lot.